Hi. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, in fact a lot about, the cult of the Black Goat, the outer god Shub-Niggurath. Now, Shub-Niggurath was created by Lovecraft, but doesn't appear in any of the stories. We see Yog-Sothoth, sort of. We see Cthulhu. We meet other entities, even Azathoth. But Shub-Niggurath is only talked about, never seen. In fact, Shub-Niggurath is generally rarely brought up, even in later stories. Though, of course, appears because so many Lovecraft stories occasionally appears. But let's talk about this cult. What are the details of it? What goes on with it? What's happening with this cult? So first off, I want to make an assumption I think is really logical, which is that the worship of Shub-Niggurath was brought to humans by the fungi from Yuggoth, from outside. Why? Well, we have to make some assumption given how little is known about her. And this is a pretty fair one, I think, because the fungi were on Earth from before there was humans. So that means Shub-Niggurath was there, because we know the fungi worship her now. Shub-Niggurath was probably known there. So the earliest humans, before they had a chance to learn about Shub-Niggurath, are likely to have gotten it from them, because the fungi seem to have, at least since humans got technologically advanced, they have been using us. They've been working with this head of a cult. Now, so let's talk about these guys. The Mi-Go, as they're sometimes called, we don't really have a name for them because they communicate with one another by light. They have light that they glow on their head and they shine off different beams of light, which means that they don't have a verbal form of communication since they mostly live in space, which is a vacuum where there's no sound. That makes sense. But now they can make surgically attach vocal cords or machines and communicate by sound, but that's not their natural way of doing it. They are described by Lovecraft as part fungoid, part surgically modified, or cybernetically enhanced, or part crustacean-looking things. But they aren't really funguses. They aren't really crustaceans because they're not even the same kind of matter we are. They're something else. Now, because we know they use science, both surgical, biological, and chemical, and everything, to control their own evolution and body form. This makes it likely that any kind of family relationships between the fungi are pretty minimal. I don't think they have, a fungi can point to his mom or his dad, even if they're even he and she, which they probably aren't. I mean, fungi on Earth have literally hundreds of genders. So I imagine the Mi-Go may not have any, or they may have hundreds, or they may be irrelevant to them. But we also know that breeding for them is probably very important because they need stock, they need specialized versions. We know they come in multiple versions. The flying ones that we see on Earth aren't the highest order of them. There's others, probably hundreds of thousands of types. So Shub-Niggurath, whatever her other traits, is pretty clearly portrayed as some kind of twisted fertility god. So what unthinkable gifts does she bestow on the Mi-Go? Because the Mi-Go have their humans worship her, organize occult activities. Something's going on with them. Now, many of her benefits might be incomprehensible to us because the Mi-Go aren't fully comprehensible and she's an outer god, so who knows? But no doubt, two obvious things are that she increases the fecundity of the Mi-Go somehow, and also provides her own spawn. She produces things, the dark young and such, for them to use. I can easily see a Mi-Go bioengineer plugging a dark young's brain into breeding tanks as the governing entity, as its computer, or maybe grafting part of a satyr onto a human for some experiment. To get another look at this, let's break down the phrase that she's always described as: the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. So the first thing here is she's called black. Why black? Well, a simple answer might be that Shub-Niggurath's actual color when she takes physical form is black. I think this is, while possible, unlikely. Lovecraft sometimes describes her as gaseous, like a cloud, which I don't think the black would fit. My own figure that I've produced for the game has her congealed into an animalistic thing. But another possibility, and even likelier, is that in many languages, for example, Arabic and English, the color black has reference to being malign. When we say his face blackened with rage, or Ben's cold black heart rejoiced, we're not talking about a color. So the Mi-Go, in labeling their god this, may want to remind humans of the dark power of Shub-Niggurath. Alternatively, she could have been labeled as the Black Goat by her enemies, saying that she was bad. And that label eventually took and was adopted by her adherents. For example, the word Christian and the word Mormon also were originally terms of attack, insults. But in both cases, both Christians and Mormons took on those epithets and adopted them, and they're fine with it, right? So, so black. Maybe it just means she's evil. Maybe it's a color. Maybe it's a little of both. If she's only somewhat dark, that may have rendered her across. Okay, so she's the Black Goat. So, goat. The Mi-Go themselves talk about Shub-Niggurath as a goat. Now, obviously, there's no goats on Yuggoth or in outer space. So they choose this animal for the humans, not for themselves. It's a symbol for the power the goat idea has for humans. Now, usually, when goats are used as a symbolic entity, it's almost always a male goat, because billy goats stink and they're unsanitary. They constantly pee on themselves. They're often aggressive and they're really interested in mating. So they're kind of a natural bad guy. But Shub-Niggurath is a rare thing. It's a symbolic female goat. So my belief is that, and I think it's defendable, is that the Mi-Go are trying to condition the human worshippers. If Shub-Niggurath is a female goat, then the humans can view themselves as the male goat, the billy goat. So they should be trying to adopt the billy goat's traits as their own, and that makes them tend to think of Shub-Niggurath and her spawn as their mates. I know, ew, huh? So, Black Goat of the woods. Okay, so why is she of the woods? There's no woods on Yuggoth. Maybe there's fungus forest, not the same thing. Well, the simple answer is that this cult, which is obviously always going to be banned by local authorities, needed a secluded place to worship. But because Shub-Niggurath's spawn are big, their sheer size is huge, it's like almost an elephant, and the fact that the Mi-Go need to fly down from the sky, they're not really underground dwellers, right? Then the cult needed somewhere out of doors to meet. A lot of cults can hide out in a basement or a cave. The Shub-Niggurath can't. She's got to be in the open. So a forest is the ideal worship site for them. There's plenty of concealment thanks to the trees. It's uninhabited. There's not people in there to visit with, and it's open to the air. A monstrous thing such as the Dark Young could live in the forest year-round. Nobody would see it except for a few unlucky passers-by. And if they did, that's good, because soon enough the forest gets a really bad reputation, and the Dark Young can stay in the forest unmolested. So, Black Goat of the woods. Adding the phrase, with 1,000 young. Okay, so 1,000 is just the Cthulhu mythos' way of symbolically saying endless or huge. Like, Nyarlathotep is described as having 1,000 forms. I'm sure he doesn't have exactly 1,000 forms, right? The point is that he can make many forms. So Shub-Niggurath has lots of young. She's a fertility god. Makes sense. But the question is, what is the 1,000 young actually referring to? So I see 3 possibilities. The most boring one is simply she's had lots of kids. That's like a given with any fertility goddess, so it's like uninteresting, so I prefer one of the other 2 possibilities. One of them is, when she enters her estrous cycle, whatever that is, she produces massive quantities of creature in one huge spawning. In other words, it's not just she's had a lot of kids over time, but this time, the time is right, the stars are right, it's time for her to spawn. And so she makes 1,000 or, a huge number in one giant batch. That's kind of scary, and it also is kind of useful for games, because it means that there's some big event possibly coming that is timed that you can molest your players with, saying, hey, Shub-Niggurath is going to spawn. That huge broodsack is going to produce 1,000 Dark Young all at once. They'll take over all of England or whatever you're worried about. So that's one possibility. The other is she simply might have many types of offspring. We know about the Dark Young, but there's others. including some that look human externally. For example, Arthur Machen wrote a story called The Great God Pan. And Pan, another fertility god connected to goats, I think is clearly, there's crossover overlap between that theory of ancient Greece and even the Arthur Machen version of it as the nature spirit and Shub-Niggurath. And there's also a short film called Dirt Dauber, which I highly recommend, which touches on this possibility. So many types of offspring, and these could be combined. She may have many types of offspring, and she also produces lots of things at once. Okay, so let's discuss satyrs. We know that there are satyrs. Satyrs are mentioned in several mythos stories, yet we hardly ever see, we only see them in a couple of Ramsey Campbell stories. But what are satyrs? I mean, we know that satyrs are connected to Shub-Niggurath. Do they even appear in Lovecraft's writings? I don't think that the common satyr that plays a pan flute and has a goat head or maybe a human head with horns and then I don't think that's what Lovecraft's talking about. But here's what I think he is talking about. An ongoing idea in Lovecraft is that the human form is not fixed. We can easily degenerate into other forms of life. This happens, for example, in his story, The Lurking Fear, where simple inbreeding results in cannibal monsters. It also happens in his story, The Rats in the Walls. In this story, the hero finds that some people have been breeding humans as food animals. The food animals are extinct by the time of the story, but he's found their bones and they actually devolved into quadrupeds eventually. Or perhaps fortunately we don't encounter any of these things alive. Like I said, they're extinct, but it's like that is simply breeding for food. They got more and more degenerate and deteriorated, but he still clearly thinks of them as human, just degenerate. Now, Wilbur Whately from the Dunwich Horror is half human. The Deep Ones also work their matter by turning people into monsters. Okay, so that they start human, then devolve. We also have the ghouls of Lovecraft, which can transform into humans, or humans can turn into them. So there's another thing. Now, of course, Deep Ones or Wilbur Whately or the ghouls aren't satyrs, but it's the same process, I think. Satyrs themselves are traditionally defined as combinations of human and beast. They have lustful elements, and they're connected to the cult of Shub-Niggurath in the mythos terms. So my belief is that logically these are humans who have been mutated by Shub-Niggurath itself into something beyond or possibly below humans. Satyr is in fact the generic term for any human that has degenerated into another form of life. This is probably the ultimate state of all worshippers of Shub-Niggurath. If you worship her, in the end, you're going to dissolve into one of these hideous beings. You're going to continue the process of mutation. You're going to become ever more insane as your body changes, ever more terrifying. Eventually, you can't hide the changes anymore, and you have to go hide out in the woods. Now, obviously, these older mutant cultists will, of course, be romping around at every Shub-Niggurath festival. So when you go to have, your, the love-in at Shub-Niggurath, there's these awful mutated creatures, plus Dark Young, plus anything. So, by the way, you should probably avoid Shub-Niggurath cult meetings, no matter how starved for love you are or how lonely you are. And there you have it. Shub-Niggurath in a pinch. She appeals to those who are really interested in sex. And if you want it at the cost of losing your humanity, she's the goddess for you.